Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and what follows is a conversation with Sean Mirski, who is a lawyer and U.S. foreign policy scholar, about his book, We May Dominate the World, Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus. The book discusses the rise of the American hegemon, and with that, on to the conversation.
The Civil War obviously was a pivotal moment in U.S. history. The nation was tearing itself apart. And from sort of a geopolitical standpoint, it was also a moment of incredible weakness for the United States, a moment at which the United States as a nation really had very little capability to defend itself from external attack or to in any way try and defend its interests abroad. And this ended up making a rather big difference because during the Civil War itself, Europe's great powers, which had been eyeing the United States with a mix of fear and dread, took the opportunity presented by the Civil War to try and reinsert themselves back into the Western Hemisphere in a big way. And so the first chapter of the book talks about the French invasion of Mexico. And this is an episode that I didn't really kind of appreciate the significance of it coming into this. But France quite explicitly took advantage of American weakness to invade and then occupy 7/8 of Mexico during the U.S. Civil War. And the idea was that the French Empire would set up a protectorate, a puppet state, right on the border with the United States, so that even if the North won the war and reunited the country, there would be a permanent obstacle to American expansion to the South. And this particular invasion, I think, has certain dramatic elements to it, but it really represented a broader sort of shift in the way that Europe's great powers were thinking about the United States and thinking about their place in the Western Hemisphere.
For those who aren't familiar, can you give some of the dramatic highlights of the French invasion?
Sure. So gosh, where to begin?
Because some of them are celebrated even to this day.
All right. So yes. So the French at that time had the greatest land army in the world, which, obviously today we make fun a little bit of French military prowess, but at the time they were quite good. But they made the initial mistake of only sending, I wouldn't call it a token force, but a force of only a little over 10,000 soldiers with which to take all of Mexico. And they didn't think very much of the Mexicans opposing them. And so this all sort of culminated in a march on the capital on Mexico City in, I believe, May 1862. And to get to Mexico City, they had to go through a town named Puebla. And it was there that the French met a resounding and quite surprising military defeat on May 5th, 1862, more commonly known today as Cinco de Mayo. So whenever Americans are shooting shots of tequila on Cinco de Mayo, they're in fact celebrating the great Mexican victory over French forces over a century and a half ago. Oddly enough, it's a holiday that's celebrated more in the U.S. than I think actually in Mexico itself, although very few Americans remember what we are celebrating. But eventually the French sort of come back with far greater forces, tens of thousands of soldiers, and the Mexicans, despite putting up a heroic resistance, get steamrolled, and the sitting government is pushed out of the capital and is essentially left to fight rearguard action and insurgency across the country. And so France really takes over the entire country, and it's only after the U.S. Civil War ends that the United States is really able to start supporting the Mexican rebels against the French, which eventually culminates in the French getting pushed out of Mexico in 1867, and the puppet emperor they had seated on the throne of Montezuma getting executed by firing squad. But the entire episode, I think, sort of sets the tone for the rest of the book because it sort of establishes that first, Europe's great powers had not reconciled themselves to basically getting pushed out of the Western Hemisphere by the United States. They very much had interest there, and they were very concerned about the rising United States, and they were very willing to act on any opportunities they saw to re-enter the hemisphere in a big way. From the American perspective, this just sort of reinforced the wisdom of what you all might remember as the Monroe Doctrine, this idea that essentially Europe's powers were barred from coming back into the hemisphere and recolonizing any part of it. I guess Why
don't we talk about the Monroe Doctrine for a second, because that's really the lurking behind all of this. What are the origins of the Monroe Doctrine? Why do we, the United States, care so much about European interventions in the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, well, so the United States, when it was first gained its independence, it was in a relatively perilous situation where it was the only independent country in the entire hemisphere. And everywhere you looked, it was either hostile Native American tribes or hostile great powers like Great Britain, France, Spain, and a little further out, Russia. And so for the first few decades of our history, American foreign policy was basically aimed at avoiding war with any of these powers while gradually expanding across the rest of the continent. So this is when you get the Louisiana Purchase, you get the Spain forced out of the Floridas. There's this massive geopolitical shift that occurs in the 1810s and 1820s because almost all of Latin America ends up gaining its independence from Spain and Portugal. And from the United States' perspective, this is phenomenal. We've gone from basically being surrounded by the only powers that really have the capacity to harm us to states that, we might not always get along well with them, but they're independent, they have a vested interest in keeping Europe out of the hemisphere, and they will never be as strong as the United States. So there's no real direct security threat from any of them. And so it's sort of in this milieu that the President Monroe in December 1823, so almost 200 years ago, declares the Monroe Doctrine, in which he basically says, Europe, you are prohibited from coming back into the hemisphere. We Americans promise not to interfere in European affairs. And the sort of subtext of the message, although Monroe sort of disclaims this, is that the United States from this point forward is going to be working to systematically eliminate Europe from the hemisphere. Its remaining outposts, its remaining colonies are going to get pushed out. And the basic security impulse is pretty obvious, which is that Europe's powers are the only ones with the capacity to harm the United States. If you can eliminate Europe from the hemisphere, you will essentially have made the United States the only great power in the entire region, which is a sort of exalted status in international relations, that of a regional hegemon, and it would make the United States invulnerable as a practical matter, because we would be protected on two sides by these massive oceans. And so that is sort of the security strategy as Monroe conceives it.
So we have the Monroe Doctrine, 1820s. Then we have the Civil War, our moment of maximal weakness, maybe, and France takes advantage of it. We kick them out. And then the story really kicks off and takes steam. And at that point, what's the condition of the U.S. as an actor in geopolitics? And how does that propel us into the various interventions and misadventures in the Western Hemisphere that you chronicle in the book?
Yeah, well, and so for the first 40 years, the Monroe Doctrine is basically not enforced, at least by us, because we don't have the military capacity to really prevent Europe from coming into the hemisphere. But we also lack the sort of political will, in large part because right around the time that the Monroe Doctrine gets announced, you also have the Missouri Compromise, and the issue of slavery starts to tear the North and the South apart. And so for over the next 40 years, you really don't have a coherent foreign policy, I would argue, on behalf of the United States. Instead, you have the North championing one particular foreign policy and the South championing another. And the result is essentially dysfunction. But after the Civil War, the issue's finally resolved. There's a united country, and the example of France and Mexico really hits home just the importance of enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. And so for the next, let's call it 90 years, century of American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine is to American foreign policy what containment becomes to the United States during the Cold War. It is the guiding North Star of American foreign policy, and nearly everything kind of is ultimately channeled through that particular lens. And this ends up being a very kind of important time for the Monroe Doctrine, because the thing to understand is that the rest of the world, this is not a happy time if you are a small and weak nation. Starting in about 1870 with the consolidation of Germany in Europe, you have this massive colonial competition among Europe's great powers that's oftentimes known as the Second Age of Imperialism, after the first of Christopher Columbus. And the statistic end up being, I think, really shocking. Between 1870 and 1900, Germany, Great Britain, and France end up colonizing something like 9 million square miles, which is twice the size of Europe itself.
You have a percentage in the book of the previously independent states in the world, how many of them survived. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
roughly 85%.
It's a very high percent that did not survive as independent nations.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, this is when you have the scramble for Africa, and Africa, Asia, and the Middle East just get all basically torn apart. One statistic, and you can quibble with this a little bit, but by the time you get to World War I, in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, there are only 3 countries, independent countries left that still have their independence in any significant way, and that's Ethiopia, Thailand, and Japan. And Japan, of course, has that independence because it has become a colonial power. And Ethiopia, of course, loses its independence a few decades later to Italy. So not a happy record if you are, as I said, a weak and small nation in this part of the world. But that 85% statistic, that remaining 15% of countries that maintain their independence, that is basically Latin America. But the challenge that American statesmen face, and the reason the Monroe Doctrine becomes so relevant, is that they are deathly worried that after Europe finishes colonizing the rest of the world, it's going to turn its competition towards the Western Hemisphere and start colonizing Latin America as well. And so that's sort of I think the central frame for kind of the way American statesmen are thinking through foreign policy during this period.
So that's the grand strategy, and then there are many individual applications of that grand strategy, many in the Caribbean, also in the Pacific.
Yes.
Let's talk about the Caribbean first. And of course, we all know the geography of the Caribbean. It's ringed with islands on the east side, and then there's land on the west side. Why is the Caribbean so important to the United States, and how does that strategic importance factor in, lead us into the various places where we find ourselves? And maybe tell us what some of the most important places are.
Yeah, well, so there's a couple reasons why the Caribbean matters enormously. The first is just proximity alone. If you establish a massive naval base in Cuba, you're less than 100 miles off the American coast. And the same is true for most of these places. They're very close to the United States, and so any significant military establishment there would be a real problem from the American security standpoint. But there's also sort of collateral interest that the United States has. The United States does not want to end up in a situation where you could have a hostile power blockading the south of the country or the Gulf ports. The United States during this period, and this is part of the book, also ends up gaining control over the Panama Canal, first building the canal and then gaining control over it.
And was that on the radar screen of policymakers before the canal existed?
Very much so. I mean, it had been sort of the assumed wisdom that at some point a canal was going to get built through Central America.
Why is that, just for those who aren't tracking?
For basically both economic and security reasons. At the time, if you were on the east coast of the United States and you wanted to go to the west coast, you could try and go across the country, although that had its challenges.
But there was no transcontinental railroad.
Yeah, not until 1860s, 1870s. But practically speaking, if you wanted to do it by ship, which is the way, if you want to ship goods in any significant way, that was the way you had to do it. You had to sail all the way down to the southern tip of South America, and then you had to sail all the way back up to the west coast. And so it'd be much, much, much cheaper if you wanted to get goods from one coast to the other to basically go through a canal in Central America. If you wanted to get to Asia as well, it's much easier to do it that way than to go, again, all the way down to South America and all the way back up. So economically, it was huge. Security-wise, it was also huge. When you're a continental power in the way the United States is, you need to defend both your East Coast and your West Coast. If you have one navy, you have a lot of uncomfortable questions about where you put that navy, especially if you seem to have threats on both sides of the continent. But if you have a canal, what you can do is you can essentially use it as a turnstile. You put your navy in the Atlantic. Looks like there's a threat from, let's say, Japan in the Pacific. You wheel your navy through the canal, and suddenly it's on the West Coast. And so everyone kind of knew that a canal at some point was going to get built. The question just was, when and under what circumstances, and what the United States would do to defend and protect it once it was built. And so one of the other major interests the United States had at this period was making sure that the countries leading to the canal, and in particular Central America and the Greater Antilles in the Caribbean, were, again, if not under the control of the United States, at least not controlled by any foreign great power. Because the canal doesn't do you much good if it turns out that, let's say, Germany controls Cuba, because functionally that'll mean that Germany controls the canal as well.
Was it foreordained that the canal would be in Panama?
No, not at all. In fact, for like decades, everyone in America assumed that it would actually get built through Nicaragua. At the time, there were like many ideas about where the canal could be built. I was telling Adam yesterday, there's these like fantastical ideas to build a railroad actually over Mexico, and to have ships go on the railroad and actually get ported across Mexico and then plopped back into the water. Shockingly, this doesn't come to fruition. But Nicaragua was a very real possibility. And Americans had done lots of surveys. There had been companies that started building a canal. Nicaragua, everyone basically assumed would be the place it would go. In part because Panama was actually was where the French had been building their canal, and it had just turned out to be a total disaster. The French company collapsed into bankruptcy. I forget the exact figures, but I think at least 10,000 Frenchmen died in the course of building it through malaria and other kind of tropical diseases. The kind of wisdom among Americans was that it was cursed ground. For reasons we can discuss, Panama ends up kind of coincidentally becoming where the U.S. actually builds the canal.
And so you mentioned Cuba. That's one of the places that pops up over and over again in the book, with a long history of U.S. entanglement there. Why don't we talk about that and how naval strategy factors into it, but also other issues, and humanitarianism combined in this interesting mix to draw the U.S. back into Cuba over and over again.
U.S. involvement in Cuba had kind of always been a factor just by virtue of proximity alone. I mean, it was unavoidable that we would be very interested in what was happening in Cuba, and Cubans would be very interested in what was happening in the United States. But in 1895, Cuba is still a colony of Spain. But the Cubans have, at this point, had enough of Spanish colonialism, and so they rebel. And you have the next 3 years of extremely bloody, destructive civil war going on in Cuba. And as the crisis sort of mounts, the kind of humanitarian impulse in the United States to intervene becomes more and more pressing. And by the time you get to 1898, I think it becomes overwhelming, combined with factors like the destruction of the USS Maine and Havana Harbor, along with a few other kind of incidents that all really sort of convince a kind of the minimum threshold of people in the United States that, for better or worse, we have to intervene in this conflict and put it to an end. And an end in which the United States promises, pinky swears going into the conflict that it will give Cuba its independence at the end of the conflict. That is actually put into law as part of the lead up to the declaration of war. And, the U.S., I think, very much meant it at the time. But the problem that the U.S. faces once it intervenes in the war and kicks Spain out and occupies Cuba is that it is worried that if it simply lets Cuba go to become a fully independent nation, that Cuba, by virtue of a lot of different factors, won't be able to sustain self-government in a way that allows it to meaningfully prevent Europe's great powers from coming in. And Germany in particular, for reasons we can discuss, is really the concern here. There's this belief among American policymakers that Germany is looking for any foothold.
Can we give a bit of background on Wilhelmine Germany? And that sort of comes out of the blue. Nobody's thinking, we're all thinking Spain, we're in the Caribbean, all of a sudden Germany's sailing around. What are they doing there? Why do they have such a big navy and so forth?
Yeah, well, so it's a complicated situation. This is all the European balance of power politics. But basically, Kaiser Wilhelm II comes into power. And during the 1890s, especially towards the end of the decade, he declares a policy called Weltpolitik, world politics. And it is essentially kind of a statement that Germany wants to be not just a great power, but a preeminent great power. And in particular, that Germany feels slighted by the fact that it has less colonies than these other European powers. And that part of its right as this rising power is to kind of amass a colonial empire of its own. The problem Germany faces, as German diplomats and soldiers are quite aware, is most of the world has already been colonized. There's really two areas left for the taking. One is China and the other is Latin America. And so very quickly Germany seizes a base in China. But the Kaiser has, I think, from the American perspective, quite an unhealthy interest in Latin America and seizing territory there. And, in the marginalia of his private policy memos that we now have access to, he left and right scrawls things like, forget the Monroe Doctrine, South America is for the Germans, blah, blah, blah. So he has, like a real interest in sort of getting into Latin America and grabbing colonies for Germany.
It sounds laughable now, but it's not any crazier than the English taking India or the French taking West Africa or any of these other
Or the French taking Mexico.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
And so, and the truth is that the Kaiser was looking for an opening. The problem the Kaiser, of course, faced was that given the balance of power on the continent, it was very difficult for him to find that opening because he was constantly worried about, French, Russian, and British military maneuvers on the continent and off the German coast. But Germany was getting there. I mean, they were building, they passed in the late 1890s what's called the First and Second Fleet Bills, which essentially took Germany from being not just the greatest land power in the world, but also with the idea of being the greatest sea power in the world. So,
and how did the German Navy compare to the U.S. Navy at that time?
It depends exactly what year you're looking at it, but at worst, comparable. At best, they were much better than the U.S. Navy, at least was the received wisdom. They had better training, they had greater tonnage. For all sorts of reasons, they were considered quite a formidable foe. And the war games of the time that the United States was running basically showed that in a war in the Caribbean against Germany that the U.S. might conceivably lose.
Okay, so I pulled you off topic.
Yeah.
We were talking about Cuba, and then the Germans come onto the scene. And so how does the Germans' appearance undermine our promise to allow Cuba to govern itself?
Well, so the United States concludes that it can't just let Cuba be fully independent, because if that happens, Cuba is likely to descend into civil war and revolution, and that is exactly the sort of thing that will attract Germany to Cuba's shores, much in the way that Mexico's own internal troubles had attracted France to its shores, 40 years earlier. And so but at the same time, the United States doesn't really want to annex Cuba for a variety of reasons, and as much as possible would like to sort of stay hands off. And so the solution that Secretary of War Root comes up with is something called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment is something that is forced on the Cubans. They are forced to put it in their constitution as a condition of independence. It has 8 articles. It establishes U.S. naval bases in Cuba. So if you wonder where Guantanamo Bay came from, it is from the Platt Amendment in 1901. But it also shackles Cuban sovereignty in ways that the Americans thought, at least, was not that dramatic. Cuba, for instance, was limited in how large of loans it could take out because the concern was that Cuba would take out these massive loans to European banks and then would end up essentially in financial thrall to a European power. There's also a provision that prevents Cuba from ceding any of its territory to a foreign power. Again, the concern that Cuba might try and sell off a strategic base to, let's say, Germany. In ways that, once again, would kind of endanger the Monroe Doctrine. But the most important part of the Platt Amendment is Article 3, which gives the United States the right to intervene militarily in Cuba in the event, essentially, that Cuba's government dissolves and there is anarchy on the island. And from the American perspective, as Root puts it, the Article 3 is essentially I forget the exact language, but something like the Monroe Doctrine in treaty form. It is this idea that in a worst-case scenario where Cuba's either under threat from a foreign great power or in a situation that is very likely to lead a great power to intervene, the United States will step in within its military to protect Cuba. And at the time it's conceived, it's not seen as this way of bullying Cuba. It's not seen as this future tool for interfering in Cuban affairs. Instead, it's seen as a sort of Damocles that, well, if anything, keep Cubans governing well because they don't want to be invaded by the United States. Of course, the problem is that's not exactly how it ends up working out.
The U.S. in this period, and we're not going to go through every one, there's too many to count, but gets involved in various interventions, small wars, you might call them, sending in the Marines in all of these places in Latin America. So just to give everybody a sense, name a few of the countries. We're not going to go through every one. Which countries get the most? How many of these are there in total? Can you describe them in a general sense to give people a sense of what's going on? Why does the U.S. get drawn in? And then how do we have trouble getting out? Because I think there are some interesting contemporary parallels there.
Yeah, so the heart of the book really focuses on this kind of interventionist period from 1898 to 1918. And during that period, if I'm remembering the statistic right, we used force an average of nearly 3 times a year against our neighbors. Some of that is relatively minor. We're landing Marines to protect an embassy during a civil war. Others, much more major. We occupy Haiti for 19 years. We occupy the Dominican Republic military government for 8 years. Nicaragua, we occupy certainly for certain periods of time. We also garrison soldiers in the capital for, almost, 20-some years. Cuba, of course, gets reoccupied several times. We intervene in Cuba regularly. First time in American history, we overthrow a foreign regime openly in 1909 in Nicaragua. And then just because we decided we were good at it, we started doing it again in 1910 and several subsequent years. And so it goes from something that the United States has literally never done in its entire 120-year history up until that point to being something the United States starts doing regularly. We declare protectorates, we annex Hawaii, we annex Puerto Rico, we annex the Danish West Indies, which become the U.S. Virgin Islands. As part of our occupations, oftentimes the locals are none too happy to be governed by Americans, and so they launch insurgencies, and we call on the Marines to conduct oftentimes quite brutal counterinsurgencies. So it's a massive degree of involvement. This is Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, Mexico, Honduras, probably forgetting one or two, Colombia. The most remarkable, there's, I think, 2 things that really stand out about this period. One is just the hyper-aggression, right? I mean, America, even to this day, obviously intervenes quite a bit abroad, but even by the standards of today, even by the standards of the Cold War, this period really stood out to me as just sort of being an unparalleled level of America using force abroad against other countries. But then the second thing, and this is sort of the kind of counterintuitive argument I make in the book, is that despite this incredibly offensive, this incredibly aggressive record, the United States was intervening largely out of defensive reasons. We've already sort of touched on kind of the theme here, but I make the argument in the book that in most cases, intervention was sort of a last resort, at least from the perspective of American policymakers, and it was launched primarily to preempt European threats. That basically there were these moments where, for various reasons, and we can get into the details, American statesmen were convinced that if they did not intervene militarily in a Latin American country, Europe would, in ways that would then lead to a European foothold in the Western Hemisphere in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which in turn would set off a scramble for Latin America, similar to what had happened in Africa. And from the U.S. perspective, this was about as close to an existential threat as you could get at the time. And so the U.S. sort of, in these situations, oftentimes with enormous reluctance, ended up launching these interventions.
There's a passage in here when you describe one of these sort of botched interventions in Nicaragua where President Coolidge sends Henry Stimson, a famous early 20th century American statesman, down to Nicaragua to go down there and straighten the matter out. And so he actually does. He hammers out this deal, which is, you probably haven't heard of this, the Peace of Tipitapa. And the terms of the deal, stop me if this sounds familiar, is that the existing president will stay in office, his name was Diaz, but he will pardon the opposition, the rebels, and bring them into his cabinet. Then the United States will supervise elections the next year and resume its efforts to organize a nonpartisan constabulary. So basically, you might call this a national army. Sounds very similar to many other things that the United States has done in recent years, trying to extricate itself from overseas interventions. And when I read this, I immediately thought of Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, the opposition leader, and we're trying to forge a unity government, and then we're going to supervise the elections, and we're going to build up the armed forces, and once we create this house of cards, we're going to quickly walk away before it blows down. And it never quite seems to work.
No, never.
Why aren't these lessons internalized by U.S. policymakers? Have we forgotten this period? If so, why? And is this a consistent pattern throughout the area that you've studied?
I'll start with the last question. It is very much a consistent pattern. To step back a little bit, the U.S. assessment of its situation and the best way to enforce the Monroe Doctrine was that the greatest threat that it faced was that one of these politically or economically unstable states would essentially offer a power vacuum that a European great power would come in and fill. And so the U.S. strategy was basically stabilize these states and strengthen them to the point where they could essentially repel any foreign attack and make it much more difficult for Europe to enter the hemisphere. We tried to do that indirectly, but starting, as I said, in 1898, we started doing it in a little bit more of an offensive, kind of tinkering with your sovereignty sort of way. And this ultimately culminates in what today we would call nation building. We end up occupying entire countries because we simply cannot figure out any other way of ensuring that Europe doesn't come in. And every time we intervene in one of these countries to sort of help stabilize them, the inevitable effect is that the country becomes more unstable than it was before. And so there's a chapter in the book where it's really the only theoretical chapter in the book where I basically just look at the record of how disastrously each one of these interventions led to its own sequel, and all of them ultimately ended up culminating in kind of these massive occupations. Because the U.S. never figured out how to nation build by force. It's for reasons that the book discusses, there's kind of factors that make
So you say the U.S. never figured it out, which I think we can probably all agree that that's true. But that sort of implies that other countries have figured it out. So I'm going to press you on this. Which other countries have figured it out? Doesn't mean you approve of them morally or anything like that. But which other countries are better at this than we are, and why?
Well, so I'm not sure I would say, I guess I'm not enough of an expert to really take a strong view on whether other countries have figured it out. I will say that at the time, all these other European great powers were establishing colonial empires in which they essentially openly ruled these foreign places and kind of integrated them into empires. The United States, in part because of our values and our principles, was never really, other than the kind of moment around the Spanish-American War, willing to do that. And in large part because of the blowback from annexing the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. basically concluded, never again, this is a disaster. And so, again, I don't want to speak to whether the European record was, any more successful at nation building, but it was, but there was at least a greater willingness to sort of come to terms with long-term occupation of a foreign people that the U.S. just never came to terms with. For every single one of these interventions, almost as soon as American boots were landed on the ground, politicians were asking, okay, how do we get out of here? In part because they didn't want to be there in the first place, and the voters certainly weren't happy about them being there. And so it's sort of,
You also talk about the perverse incentives for local partisans created by the presence of an outside power. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, so I mentioned the Platt Amendment earlier, this idea that you're going to have a sort of Damocles over the head of the Cubans, and they're going to behave well because no Cubans wouldn't want the United States to reoccupy the country. And at a certain level, that seems like that makes sense. The problem was it didn't really account for the fact that a lot of these countries were extremely ideologically polarized, something that we as Americans can now appreciate, and that oftentimes the factions hated each other more than they hated external powers. And so there's this, what a reporter calls this Alice in Wonderland moment in 1906, where there's a civil war in Cuba between the moderates and the liberals. And the moderate government basically wants the U.S. to intervene and occupy the country so that it can shore up the moderate government and keep it in power. The liberal rebels who are fighting the moderate government also want the U.S. to intervene and occupy the country because they basically conclude that after the U.S. leaves, they'll hold elections and all the kind of usual democratic mumbo-jumbo that the United States likes to do. And as a result of that, the liberals think they have the greater popular support, so they think they'll win once the U.S. leaves anyway. And so both the liberals and the moderates, who are literally like shooting at each other, agree that the one thing that they really want is the U.S. to come in and reoccupy the country under the Platt Amendment. The one actor who doesn't want this is the United States. Theodore Roosevelt is like livid in his Oyster Bay vacation home, and he's just like harumphing around and yelling at Cubans, imaginary Cubans, about how can you be so stupid? Please, like, don't make us do this. But the U.S. basically, the Cubans basically force him into a situation where he just cannot avoid it. And so he ends up landing troops and reoccupying Cuba for 3 years. And this is not, the Cuban example is like a particularly vivid one, but this sort of perverse dynamic, the mere presence of U.S. force as sort of an external balancer, in multiple countries across the hemisphere leads local actors to try and do things to bring the United States in, or to provoke an American intervention on the understanding that it will sort of advance their kind of narrow self-interests. And so the U.S. gets sucked into a lot of this.
One more anecdote from an interesting place on the map, and then we'll talk about some contemporary parallels. And all our students out there, please start thinking about your questions. Hawaii, we all know it as a lovely tropical vacation paradise, but Hawaii, of course, was not always part of the United States. In fact, it was an independent monarchy until quite late in the 19th century. And so can you explain why Hawaii is part of the United States today, and why, if indeed you believe this, it is geostrategically important to the United States?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the latter question. There's no, I think, disputing Hawaii's importance. The understanding of the time, and I think this is actually true to this day, is that Hawaii's sort of geographic importance is really almost unrivaled across the rest of the world. And what I mean by that is that Hawaii's like ballpark 2,000 miles west of San Francisco. If you take a compass and you put one end of the compass in Honolulu and the other one 2,000 miles away and you draw a circle, you're going to take in about 1/12 of the world's surface, right? A huge chunk of the world. If you did that same exercise anywhere else in the world, you would sweep in, dozens of states, nations, civilizations. You do that exercise from Hawaii to San Francisco in that circle, there's literally nothing there other than Hawaii itself. There's a few small Pacific isles, but for the most part, the only significant landmass is Hawaii, and the rest is just the waters of the Pacific Ocean. And the reason this matters is because at the time, navies were powered by steam. And to have a steamship navy, you need coal. And to have coal, you need coaling stations. Functionally speaking, each naval vessel, each just vessel of any sort, was limited by how much coal it could carry in its bunkers. And so they could only go so many miles before they basically had to recoal. Hawaii thus acted as basically a gas station in the middle of the desert. You could not make it from San Francisco to Japan, for instance, without refueling somewhere along the way. And as I mentioned, there is nowhere else to refuel in the Northern Pacific other than Hawaii. What this meant strategically for the United States was that if Hawaii either stayed independent or was part of the United States, the U.S. West Coast was almost invulnerable because it would be extraordinarily difficult for any foreign navy to be able to steam all the way to the West Coast and then fight, presumably, the U.S. Navy there without operating at a huge disadvantage, possibly in a way that would be dispositive. On the other hand, if Hawaii ever fell under the control of, let's say, Great Britain or Japan, then you start to have a major problem because that great power can use Hawaii as a launching pad for launching invasions of the West Coast in a way that is very, very difficult for the United States to combat. And so the naval tacticians of the day basically all agreed that Hawaii was just absolutely crucial to the safety of the West Coast, much in the way that, as we were discussing earlier, the Greater Antilles and much of Central America were really important to the security of the East Coast and the Gulf. And so the United States didn't necessarily need to take Hawaii itself. It just needed to make sure no one else could take Hawaii. The problem was, though, that Hawaii's situation for a variety of reasons that I get into the book, but I'll simplify a little bit here. Its internal political situation was disintegrating. And by the early 1890s, the Hawaiian monarchy, there's a coup that overthrows the Hawaiian monarchy. It's led by native or Hawaiian-born individuals, but they are predominantly white. They're predominantly part of the oligarchy of the islands, and their interests are very much opposed to sort of the
And these are sugar planters, largely.
Yeah, not so much sugar planters. Sugar planters actually did not want to be annexed to the United States by and large. There's this misconception that sugar planters kind of did this, but it's mostly the sort of the kind of orbit of sugar planters. So the lawyers,
It's always the lawyers.
It's always the lawyers. The main rebel is a lawyer. The consultants, the sort of the kind of the white oligarchy of the islands that sort of lives off the sugar plantations but aren't sugar planters themselves. They basically seize control against the wishes, of course, of the native Hawaiians, who by and large are just like adamantly opposed to this new government. And they do so with the help of the U.S. Navy. Scholars debate a little bit about exactly the extent to which the U.S. Contributed to the coup, but I think it's fair to say that it was primarily led by actual Hawaiians rather than the U.S. itself. But this new republic petitions the United States for annexation. The problem is it's a new administration's coming into the office, and Grover Cleveland says, no, this is we're not annexing Hawaii, not least because we were involved in the overthrow of the kingdom. This is entirely inappropriate, blah, blah, blah. But the problem that the United States faces is that, again, for reasons that I get into the book that are a little complicated, there's a serious problem with the demographics of Hawaii, and in particular with the fact that the sugar plantations have been importing labor from Japan for the last, let's say, decade and a half in just massive numbers. And the problem really becomes acute in 1896 when the census reveals that the Japanese have become the second largest ethnic group on the islands. And if you look just at voting age males, they are far and away the largest ethnic group. The Japanese don't have the right to vote, in part because the white oligarchy has very carefully gerrymandered the kind of voting rights in a way that excludes non-whites from the franchise. But the problem is that Japan, at this point, is now a great power. It has just clobbered China in the Sino-Japanese War, and it begins to take a real interest in what's going on in Hawaii. And it sends a gunboat in early 1897 with basically demands on the Hawaiian government to give the Japanese citizens on the islands the franchise. And from the U.S. perspective, and from the Hawaiian perspective, this would very quickly lead to Japanese control of the islands and lead to Hawaii becoming a Japanese colony. And so the U.S. basically decides, we've, as long as possible, sort of resisted annexing Hawaii, but given what's about to happen and given the concern that Japan is about to take it over, now is the time to sign a treaty of annexation and agree to bring Hawaii into the Stars and Stripes. And it ends up being a much closer call than the U.S. realizes at the time. After the Treaty of Annexation is signed, the Japanese minister in Washington sends a secret telegram to Tokyo in which he very, very strongly urges the Japanese government to launch a surprise attack on Hawaii to preempt the American annexation of it. His superiors in Tokyo, while incensed at what the Americans are doing, decide to not attack Hawaii, and so Pearl Harbor ends up being postponed by another 44 years.
When you see the contemporary news out of Hawaii after the fire and the disputes or complaints by Native Hawaiians that they're being ignored, does this evoke this history that you
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's still a very, I think, strong Native Hawaiian movement in Hawaii that basically continues to see Hawaii as occupied territory. And even at the time, I mean, the Native Hawaiians really organized themselves in a pretty incredible way, and they send a petition to Washington that has something like 27,000 signatures, which doesn't necessarily seem like that much until you realize that the Hawaiian population as a whole was something like 40,000 at the time. So this is the majority of Native Hawaiians on multiple islands. You don't have cell phones. You can't text people to get their signatures. This is like across multiple islands, people getting the signatures over a course of months. And this petition just adamantly opposes annexation. But from the perspective of U.S. congressmen, some of them don't really care about this to begin with. Native Hawaiians are brown, they're not white, who cares? But for many who do actually care about these sorts of the values, the principles of it, they basically look at the situation and say, if there was a chance of Hawaii maintaining its independence, maybe this petition would mean something. But right now it's a decision between us and Japan, and that is the choice that we face. And given that choice, it better be the United States over Japan. And so there's a real element of tragedy to it, I think, on the part of at least some statesmen, because they sort of see this as not just a zero-sum game, but a real negative-sum game where they're just choosing among the least of bad options.
One of the words in perhaps the most intriguing book in the subtitle of your book is anxiety.
Yes.
And anxiety that great powers often feel despite their strength. And of course, we as Americans, despite being the strongest power in the world, are constantly talking about threats. And we have an annual threat briefing from our intelligence community. And so we feel ourselves to be very threatened despite being the most well-armed country in the history of humanity. And
having two moats on either side of us and no great power in our hemisphere. Yeah.
Exactly. And so if we extrapolate here, arguably the book is not just about the American experience, but about the anxiety that great powers feel, and particularly in their near abroad, in their home turf. And this brings up some very interesting and potentially awkward contemporary parallels where the United States' two principal geopolitical adversaries, China and Russia, in that order probably, both feel themselves to be very threatened in their near abroads, and in fact are contesting, whether overtly or in a sort of Cold War type struggle with respect to Taiwan, contesting their near abroads with the United States right now. What should American policymakers either have learned or be learning from our own historical experience and our own near abroad that would bear upon our dealings with China and Russia?
One of the chronic weaknesses of American foreign policy is sort of a tendency to, at least rhetorically, see the world in terms of black and white, to sort of assume that we have benign motives and that our adversaries have, the blackest of kind of motives and are sort of these like cartoonish villains. And sometimes that's true. I mean, you look at like World War II or whatever, it's different. I mean, there's obviously tremendous nuance and subtlety and sort of grayness, moral grayness on both sides, but it's relatively easy to characterize that as a conflict of good versus evil, right? But but for much of the rest of international politics, I think that's a harder way to see things. And I think what the book I hope will show policymakers is that there's need to understand that first, from these countries' perspective, from Russia and China's perspective, what they are looking to do is not that different from what the United States itself did. And it is also particularly grating on them when they hear the United States say, well, we oppose spheres of influence, and we believe that any country, I believe Secretary Blinken was saying this yesterday here, we believe that any country has the right to choose which alliances it wants to enter, and which essentially military organizations it wants to be a part of. And the sort of answer is, really? Do you really believe that? Would you really be fine if, let's say, Mexico had joined the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War? Or would you be fine if today Mexico formed a military alliance with China? There's a degree of sort of double standards, I think, that other countries perceive Americans as having. And sort of knowing the history of our own rise, including some of these more unpleasant kind of darker moments, I think helps give context to kind of the way that our adversaries see the world and the way they think about them. I think it also establishes what you might call a sort of tragic point, which is, I mentioned earlier that the U.S. was launching these interventions with great frequency, but also great reluctance. Many American policymakers were not thrilled to be invading our neighbors. There's exceptions, but on the whole, most, even ones like Theodore Roosevelt, were actually quite disappointed that they, from their perspective, had been forced into the situation. And they also understood that what they were doing was counter to American values and principles. There were kind of attempts to justify it, but I think if you look at the writing and the private writing and the diary entries and all that, it sort of shows that Americans understood that this was not the way it was supposed to turn out. And I think that matters because it suggests that you can't count on values and principles alone to sort of guide foreign policy, that there will be situations where, for reasons of kind of security imperatives, nations ultimately decide that they need to use force in ways that are counter to their values and principles. And so this matters for a country like China, which, I think many Chinese diplomats and soldiers genuinely believe that China is different from other great powers, that it will rise in a peaceful way unless the United States does something crazy, and that there is no real desire to, let's say, bully China's neighbors or anything like that. But the point that the book makes is that you can have situations develop in which, for all those good intentions, it just doesn't end up being enough, and that there's still going to be real incentives to use force in a way that can be quite ultimately bloody and violent and unpleasant for everyone involved. And so that's a little bit of a sobering lesson, but I think it matters for China and Russia today.
So I'll just end with the meta, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, so get ready. I'll end with a meta question here. It seems to me that this book is implicitly about the mental models that we use to understand foreign affairs and international relations. And if I may characterize your perspective, I won't use the epithet realist, but I will just say that it's sort of cold, hard strategic logic. And it's the country's geography, its military situation, its economic situation, and so forth, and other factors that you take into account as well, like some internal political dynamics. But of course, it seems that many of our policymakers in Washington have a different mental model. You called it democracies versus autocracies, or the rules-based order, and this idea that U.S. grand strategy follows from our values, and our values dictate that we have an international order based on rules. And then we take that lens, we put it in front of our eyes and glance around the world, and that tells us how to interpret the world.
Yeah. Well, so I'll say that I think in the abstract, the two models don't have to be inconsistent with each other. And one of the points I want to make in the book, because sometimes the spirit of history, for those who are familiar with it, it is sort of assumed that the United States either was overcome by this sort of burst of imperialist fever, or that it was, let's say, banana companies and Wall Street banks running American foreign policy, or what have you. But this sort of attempt to explain away what we did as being sort of some small minority group controlling U.S. foreign policy in a way that is not necessarily representative of kind of like if true Americans had been at the helm, things would have turned out differently. But as I said, one of the points of the book is to show that actually, American leaders were quite cognizant of kind of the values and principles that they held, and also quite cognizant that what they were doing was inconsistent with them. The point the book, I think, makes, and this is the realist aspect of it, is that if you're a nation, much as if you're an individual, if your survival is at stake, there's very little you won't do, no matter how much it conflicts with your values and principles. In kind of a concrete individual context, like, to make it just even easier, if you have a family, right, and they're in mortal danger, there is very little you won't do, no matter how much it contravenes your morals or principles. And that's just sort of a fundamental reality of, that survival is a threshold question for anything else, right? You cannot be a moral, principled actor if you do not exist. And so survival really ends up being sort of the threshold. And whenever it's implicated in any serious way, the result is that powers are going to be kind of, I think, driven by that impulse to act in particular ways. And so that's the realist story. But at the same time, the realist story isn't all of it, right? I mean, there are many times in international politics where nations don't feel that their survival is at stake, and it's at those times that they can, in some sense, become their own better angels. And so even during this period, after the end of World War I, the U.S. sort of comes out as a regional hegemon. At this point, all of Europe's great powers are lying in ashes on the ground, and there's just no real question anymore that the Monroe Doctrine will be violated, or that the U.S. will face this, what it sees as an existential threat. And so what does the U.S. do? It starts to dismantle its sphere of influence. It ends its occupations. It pulls its Marines out. It stops interfering in its neighbors' affairs, and this all culminates in the mid-1930s with something called the Good Neighbor Policy. And this is the United States interacting with the region as it has always wanted to interact with the region, but has never, again, from its perspective, been able to do. And so I don't think the two models are necessarily inconsistent. What I would say, and this is the realist part of me coming out, is that if they're in conflict, if the security imperatives lead you one way, it is very difficult for the other kind of model to win out. And so right now, it's kind of understandable why the United States is trumpeting this sort of rules-based order, democracy, all that. Its security isn't directly at stake in any of these situations. And so it really is kind of, from its perspective, it's perfectly able to act consistent with its values. But as I said, if Mexico decides it wants to join a military alliance with China, I'll be curious to see what the U.S. starts saying then, because I suspect that it won't be...
No prizes for guessing.
Yeah, it won't quite be what it's doing right now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.